Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went inside. He saw and believed. They still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to where they were staying. Now Mary stood outside the tomb, crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They have taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they have put him." At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize it was Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned towards him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord," and she told them that he had said these things to her. On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he had said this, he showed them his hands and side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. Again, Jesus said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." And with that, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, their sins are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven." Now, Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were in their house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here, see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God."
It's good to see you all. Thanks for coming out on a Saturday night. I didn't know that the Shawshank trailer was going to be on there. That brings back memories from me from quite a long time ago. But one thing I discovered a few years ago is that was on everybody's top 5 favorite films for years and years and years. Some survey or other said that it was there. Taps into that thing, you see, the hope. When I went to watch it in the cinema, I remember when, and I'm just assuming you've all seen it, and I don't care if I spoil it for you, but when the wicked guy that runs the prison goes in, the cell's empty, and he throws the thing at the poster on the wall, and it goes through, and the hole and everything is there. Everybody in the cinema cheered, and there was this kind of great feel-good sense it was kind of the king of the feel-good movies, really, for a long time. Well, this evening we're talking about hope as we round off this week of events together put on by the Christian Union here. And when we think about hope, I think it's fair to say that all of us want our lives to count for something. Some of us, I'm guessing, in a place like this have designs on public office. Some of us perhaps have big plans. We want to leave our mark in a distinctive way. We think that the New Year's honours list is kind of lying ahead, and that's what we're aiming for, and that's what we want our legacy to be. Well, I wish you well. I look forward to seeing you at the Palace. But even if those of us with more humble ambitions want our piece in this drama called life, we want it to be significant. We want what we do to matter. We want to have good relationships. We want to have a good reputation with other people. We want our work, whatever our work will be, we want it to be done well. Isn't that why we make plans? Isn't that why we have the ambitions that we have for what we want to do with our lives? Isn't that why we get up in the morning? Or for most of you, the afternoon, I'm guessing. But there's a problem. You see, we make these plans and we think like this and we want these things, but there's a problem. You see, we need to factor into all of these desires the awkward and inconvenient, but nonetheless unavoidable reality of death. Now, that's a bit of a downer, isn't it? It's a bit of a downer on an evening like this. I realize too that it's a bit of a taboo, a cultural taboo, to talk about death in polite company like this evening. But sometimes taboos need to be trod on. They need to give way to reality. And in my life, this reality came to me, rushing in on me. In fact, when I came across something written by the Russian author Leo Tolstoy a while ago. Tolstoy, you will know, some of you at least, he wrote some of the finest literature that we have. He wrote War and Peace. He wrote Anna Karenina and several other works. His contribution to our world was on a level that many of us can only dream of. And yet, when he came to turn 50, he began to question his life. And I've got a quote which will come up, I hope, on the screen. He said this: "My question, that which at the age of 50 brought me to the verge of suicide, was the simplest of questions, a question without an answer to which one cannot live. It was, what will come of what I am doing today or tomorrow? What will come of my whole life? Why should I live or do anything?" The question can also be expressed like this: is there any meaning in my life that the inevitable death awaiting me does not destroy? And do you see his point? Do you see the reason for his anguish? He's saying, if death always wins, what grounds for hope in anything do we have? This came home to me personally quite recently. I said to you last night that my wife is pregnant. She's in the early stages of pregnancy. Her wee tummy is growing now and starting to show the early signs of life. Now, in the same week where we started to announce that news to people and started to let people know about the baby, I got a phone call from my cousin in Australia. He doesn't often phone me. I knew that there was something unusual about this, but he was ringing to say that his dad, my uncle, had suddenly died. Right at the very same time. So right beside each other here, we have life and death. And the question that I'm left asking with those two experiences, I look one way and I see the very earliest signs of life. I look the other way and my uncle has just died. And I'm left asking, in the space between now and then for this baby, what does it matter how it lives its life? I mean, think about it in terms of what this baby might do. If death wins, if death has the last word in everything, what does it matter if this child's life is good or bad? Whether they discover a cure for cancer or they spend their life in terrorism, what difference does it make? If death has the last laugh all the time, how is any hope that we, my wife and I, have for this child's life not rendered utterly useless? Arthur Schopenhauer, the German philosopher, puts this really starkly. Again, the quote, it's a long one, should come up on the screen for you. He said this: "Yet what a difference there is between our beginning and our end. We begin in the madness of carnal desire and the transport of voluptuousness. We end in the dissolution of all our parts and the musty stench of corpses. And the road from the one to the other too goes, in regard to our well-being and enjoyment of life, steadily downhill. Happily dreaming childhood, exultant youth, toil-filled years of manhood, infirm and often wretched old age, the torment of the last illness, and finally the throes of death. Does it not look as if existence were an error, the consequences of which gradually grow more and more manifest? We shall do best to think of life as a process of disillusionment, since this is clearly enough what everything that happens to us is calculated to produce." I don't think it gets any more brutal than that. He sounds like a Welsh rugby fan waking up this morning. We shall do best to think of life as a process of disillusionment. But here's the thing, can we fault his logic? It's hard, you see, if there's no God and if death is all there is, then our existence is entirely accidental and it doesn't matter how any of us, this little baby that we have or any of us, actually behave. If my child creates the finest art, the finest poetry, if it grows up to be as talented as Emily here, singing and playing so well for us, creates the finest poetry, the finest music, whatever, it just doesn't matter. Ultimately, in the end, it counts for nothing. What about their relationships? All of us invest time and effort and energy in establishing loving relationships, and we make sacrifices and we take risks and we put others first. But then you die. And you're no different to the person who just spent their life using and abusing other people. My father was a good man. He was a kind husband and father. He was a good friend to his friends. He was a good laugh. He was a decent man. He died nearly 20 years ago, and his grave is in a Belfast graveyard just meters away from somebody who was a terrorist, somebody who invested their life trying and being reasonably successful at killing other people. And that's it. If death is the end, ultimately, that's it. If the grave wins, the difference between how those two people, my dad and the terrorist, treated people just doesn't matter. And it's the same for us all. If we love people or hate them, if we care for people or use them, if we're popular or lonely, ultimately nobody will care. Death renders our relationships meaningless. Can you see how this works? We do. We want our lives to count for something. We want them to have meaning and significance, but the reality of death stands in the way of all of that. If death wins, then everything we consider foundational to real human flourishing has no real significance. And old Macbeth was right. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. Life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. If death is all there is, then our lives signify precisely nothing, and it's hopeless. But that doesn't fit with how we feel, does it? It doesn't fit with the longings that are in there, deep within. I mentioned Foy Vance, the Irish singer-songwriter, last night. He has a song called Two Shades of Hope, where he talks about the pain that being given hope in the face of hardship brings when that hope ultimately doesn't deliver. I guess that's why love hurts, he says, and heartache stings, and despair's never worse than the despair that earth brings, but hope deals the hardest blows. You'll be able to relate to that if you've been told, someone in your family perhaps chronically ill, and they've been told that there's a treatment that might work and it might put an end to the sickness, and ultimately doesn't. And having the hope that it might have done makes the whole thing worse. But he sings this song and it seems to resonate, but there's one line that then goes deep, I think, in all of our hearts, and it's this. He says, hope deals the hardest blows, but I cannot help myself but hope. See, deep in us all is an instinct that our lives do matter, that our relationships matter, that loyalty and faithfulness and trust and honesty are good things, and that they do make a difference and that they do matter. Deep in us all, there is this sense that our achievements matter, that there is more to what we've done than a few words on a granite headstone at the end of the day. And the Christian claim is that that intuition is there, that instinct and that desire, that longing is there, because we were created for more than we can touch and see. Kate Douglas, writing in The New Scientist, describes our whole existence as just a passing whim. But what if that isn't the case? What if there might be a reason to believe death isn't the end? That all our hopes and everything we most value won't be destroyed? What would you give to find out if that was true or not? Well, Christianity says that we don't have to accept a hopeless view of the world, because 2,000 years ago, Jesus Christ rose from the dead. That's what we heard. It was read there. If you could turn that up again, page 50 in the little John's Gospels that you should have there. I'm going to look at a few verses as we go through that passage of the Bible. The resurrection of Jesus means two big things. Number one, it means that Jesus defeats death. The whole Christian faith stands or falls at this point. The resurrection is the thing upon which everything stands or falls in the Christian faith. And this sort of thing, people rising from the dead, isn't run-of-the-mill. So we need to check the evidence. We need to see if it is a credible claim. And I want to draw your attention to two categories. Number one, the empty tomb. It's there in verses 1 and 2. the empty tomb. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They've taken the Lord out of the tomb and we don't know where they've put him." This is 3 days after Jesus was publicly and professionally executed by the religious and secular authorities of the day. Mary and some other women come to Jesus' tomb to look inside, to go and find him, to prepare his body. And it's empty. All that's there are a few bandages. The body is gone. Now let's be clear, no one expected this. She didn't go there thinking he wasn't going to be there. I come across people, it's normal to hear people say that they deny the resurrection of Jesus Christ because these things don't happen. They say it didn't happen because these things don't happen. But that is to decide the outcome before considering the details. But that's exactly what Mary thought. She expected him to be there. These things don't happen. So where was the body? Well, some people have proposed a number of options. One of them is that through the history of the church, here are the main objections, the main options that are given. Number one, maybe Jesus didn't die. He was unconscious, but in the cool of the tomb, he revived and he got up and he left, and out he went. The problem with this is that he was executed by people who knew what they were doing. They killed people for a living. They knew what a dead person looked like. We're told in the story that they speared him, and when they speared him, water and blood that had separated came out. And doctors say that that's what happens after death. Plus, how would one man on his own have been able to move the huge stone at the tomb entrance? The second option is maybe the authorities could have taken it, people say. In fact, that's what the disciples think. Verse 2 tells us that. But that makes no sense, you see, because if they had it, then all they had to do was show everyone, and this whole story wouldn't have got off the ground. They wanted him to be dead, and they made up a story to cover for it because they couldn't find the body. They didn't take the body. The third option is the disciples stole it, and they hid it somewhere. But I want to say that doesn't really make sense either. The disciples were terrified at this point. When Jesus was arrested and sentenced to death, they all ran away, fearing the same would happen to them. We read later on that they're locked in a room, afraid. They think the authorities are going to get them. These guys, they didn't have stealing a body on their mind. They were terrified. And as time moved on, each one of them actually paid with their lives for proclaiming that Jesus had risen from the dead. Now, it's unlikely that you're going to endure torture if you know that the body is hidden in your mate's garage. The empty tomb. The second category that I want us to notice is the eyewitnesses. So in verse 6 we have Peter and the other disciple. We know who is John, the author of the book. Verse 8, they saw the empty tomb firsthand. Then we're told about Mary, verse 10, and this is important. Mary's testimony here is important because Mary is a woman. Now, why is this important? Well, because in this culture, women weren't... women were marginalized, and their testimony wasn't even considered valid in a court of law. Now, why does that matter? Well, because if you were going to make up a story that Jesus had risen again from the dead, you wouldn't use women as your eyewitnesses because nobody would believe it. The only reason that there is to say that women were the first people there is that women were the first people there. Then it's the disciples' turn, verse 20. And finally, then there's Thomas, verses 24 and following. I feel for Thomas a bit because of these events. Since these events, right the way through, Thomas has been known as Doubting Thomas. And that phrase has come down into our language. But I'd have been exactly the same. Thomas wasn't present when Jesus first appeared to the disciples, and he was present when Jesus died. He'd seen him die, and he hadn't seen him with other people. So he's skeptical. I would have been skeptical as well. But Jesus appears to him. Verse 27 and says, "Peace be with you, Thomas. Put your finger here in my hands." Makes him touch the hole in his hands. "Reach out, put your hand into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas the skeptic is convinced. And the end of our reading, "My Lord and my God." He sees him. He touches him. Now, that's the eyewitnesses. Now, none of them expected to see Jesus, but he appeared to them and they were convinced. And there were many more. Another New Testament writer tells us that he appeared to 500 people at one time. And when he was writing the letter that he said that in, many of those people would still have been alive. And he was saying, look, go and ask them if you don't believe me. He appeared to numerous people all at once. Go and ask them. It can be checked for credibility. Now, again, I hear people say, oh, well, look, actually, people back then were more gullible than we are nowadays. They're more willing to believe that dead people came back to life again. That's nonsense. That's what C.S. Lewis calls chronological snobbery. That is to think that we're somehow more clever and more sophisticated than those dullards all those years ago. That's not right. The idea of Jesus coming back to life again, dead men don't rise. They never have, and nobody ever thought that it was the sort of thing that would just happen. It was just as implausible back then as it is to all of us, to people today. And all of the evidence suggests that people back then had just as much trouble believing it as we do today. But the fact that thousands of people did believe suggests that the evidence was just too compelling. Excuse me. One historical professor, N.T. Wright, has said this: the early Christians did not invent the empty tomb and the meetings or sightings of the risen Jesus. To suggest otherwise is to stop doing history and to enter into a fantasy world all of our own. Now, in conversations with a number of you this week, you've said to me, look, I just don't think there's enough evidence for Christianity. I want to say, what do you make of the empty tomb? What do you make of what the eyewitnesses saw and said? What's your more plausible alternative that fits all of these facts? You've got to ask yourself that question before you dismiss it. Jesus defeated death. That's the first thing that the resurrection tells us. But then, what's that got to do with us? Why is that something that brings us hope? Well, then, that's our second point, and it's this. It's because it destroys despair. The fact that Jesus defeated death means that it destroys despair. And we get a glimpse of this with Mary. Did you see? She starts in tears, verse 11. She's at the tomb. She's in despair. She thinks that death has won again. But look how that changes when she realizes that Jesus is alive. Down at verse 17, she's overcome. She grabs him, and with a sense of delight, she wants to hold on to him. Jesus says, do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them I'm ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, I've seen the Lord. See, Mary shifts from despair, tears at the tomb, to hope, simply because she met the resurrected Jesus and understood what that implied. A few years ago, the Australian comedian Tim Minchin spoke at a graduation ceremony in his homeland, and he began by saying this: arts degrees are awesome, and they help you find meaning where there is none. And let me assure you, there is none. Don't go looking for it. Searching for meaning is like searching for a rhyme scheme in a cookbook. You won't find it, and you'll ruin your souffle. Of course, if death is the end, he's right. But why do we even search for meaning? Why this intuition that our lives should be meaningful when the only world we've ever known is one where everyone dies? Well, it's because the Bible teaches us that it's because death is an intruder. Death is a sign that something has gone wrong in our world, that the relationship with the source of life and meaning and significance, the relationship with the God who made us, that we were designed to have, is broken. That's why we die. Death is not just a biological accident, it's a spiritual reality. And the Bible makes sense of why we have this longing for meaning and significance, even in a world like that. And it shows us why that search will not end unless our relationship with God is restored. If Jesus didn't rise, Minchin is right. If death wins, everything is pretty bleak. But because Jesus gets through death, he has the power to get you and me through death as well. That's a great hope. And it means that our despair is lifted. That's why when Mary finds Jesus, she embraces him. It's such a moment of hope and relief. Her shattered dreams have been pieced back together in that single moment. That's why when Jesus calls God my Father and your Father, those are words that can transform your life and my life. Because what he's saying there is, if you trust in Jesus, you're drawn into the divine family. And that is a family that gives the whole of your life purpose. See, at root, Jesus didn't die and rise again to resolve the philosophical problem of human significance. He died and rose again so that you could feel his embrace for eternity. So that the relationship that really matters in your life, the relationship between you and the one who sits at the center of reality, could be restored. Yes, the resurrection means that the way that you live now, what you achieve, your contribution to the world, the relationships that you invest in, it means that they will have lasting effect. That's right. Yes, it also means that Jesus will one day assess our lives. We will all give an account for how we have lived, and perfect justice will one day be done. But above all, the resurrection of Jesus Christ gives us a certain hope of a seat around God's family table where there is feasting and joy for eternity. Now, like Mary, our lives will still be marked by the frustrations of the everyday. Our lives will still be stained by the grief and tragedy that marks human life in a broken world. But Jesus taught that his resurrection wasn't the end of a story, but the beginning. The beginning of God's new world. The beginning of a world where pain and mourning and everything else that renders this world meaningless are no more. And so from that day on, Mary knew that her future was not in the tomb, but in the garden. It wasn't to anoint the dead, but to embrace the living. It wasn't to die, but to live. And that's the hope that Jesus' followers have had ever since. That is the hope that I hold out to you this evening. That is the hope that is on offer to all of us in Jesus Christ. I'd love you to take it. I'd love you to receive it. I'd love you to have it for eternity. Now, we will all respond to this. And I want to encourage you to respond. But in a gathering like this, I imagine that there are at least 3 different kinds of people. Some of you are here and you've come along throughout the week. You maybe come just this evening. You've been hearing bits and pieces along the way. You're still not sure that you really get it all. Still not sure you can get your head around it. And the way that you'll know that you haven't fully understood it is if you don't think that it is the best news you've ever heard. If this is not the best news that you've ever heard, you can be sure you have not understood the heart of the Christian gospel. So if that's you, I'd encourage you to explore it further. You will have been, you'll see these little cards, little pieces of paper on your seat. If you can just grab one of those now, just make sure you've got it. I can tell you about the details that are on there. There's a follow-up course called Closer Inspection, and the details are on there. If you're not sure that you really get it yet, if this isn't the best news you've ever heard, come along to the follow-up course. Put your details on here, and somebody from your college will follow you up and help you explore this further. I'd love to help you to do that. Second group of people, you're here and you know that you don't want this. You're just not interested and you want to reject Jesus Christ. Well, can I encourage you, please, that if you want to reject Jesus Christ, that you make sure that you reject the real Jesus Christ. See, what I mean by that is I've talked to people this week and they've said, I don't like this about Jesus, I don't like this about Jesus, and I don't like this about Jesus. And I say, I don't like those things either. But that's not the Jesus that I know. That's not the Jesus who gives us satisfaction and love and hope. So I'd encourage you to take this John's Gospel away. It's free to you. Just take it and read it through so that if you are going to reject Jesus Christ, at least you're rejecting Jesus as he reveals himself. And some of you are here and you're convinced. You've been coming along all week and you want the satisfaction and the love and the hope that Jesus offers. Well, if that's you, to do that, you need to come to God and say 3 simple things. You need to admit something, you need to believe something, and you need to commit to something. That is, you need to admit that you have sinned against God and His world. You've pushed Him out of the picture and lived your way. You need to believe that Jesus' death and resurrection are all that can save you. And you need to commit to turn from your sin and trust in Jesus. Now, to enable you to do that, the guys are going to put a prayer up on the screens. And you can, in a moment or two, just have a look at that, read it through for yourself. In a moment or two, I'm going to read it through slowly, pray it through slowly, and if you want to make it your own, echo in your heart the words that I say. Just before we do that, as you read that again, we'd love to hear from all of you. So if you just take a moment at the end to fill in your details on here, if you want people to follow you up or if you want to be in touch with others, you can do that. Just sign on there. But also, any comments, just write them on the back and drop them in. It's really helpful for us as we hear back from how you have found this week. So just have a read through. Lord God, I have sinned against you, choosing to do things my way rather than follow you. Thank you for sending Jesus to die for my sin and offer me forgiveness. I want to turn from my sin and trust in Jesus for my salvation. Amen. I'm going to finish there. I'm going to hand back to Tim. Thank you for listening.